So I just wanted to make a quick video on the nature of rationality as it regards to racism, to concepts like slavery and social Darwinism, and Nazism, and how the rational world we just left and the morally relativistic philosophical landscape, full of fuzzy logic and nuance and perceptual errors and emotions that we currently inhabit, and how these things basically lend themselves towards a world of brutality and domination, if not hemmed in by some sort of ethical puritanism regarding equity and basically race Marxism. So I guess let me begin by defining some terms for people who might not know what these terms mean. So rationalism is effectively the belief that logic can get you to... that logic is everything you need, that it can structure society in a rational sense, that it can structure... that basically logic can structure all human interactions. Now, there's some problems with this. But this philosophy gave birth to traditions like Marxism, which is pretty clearly was pretty clearly a destructive endeavor. It didn't work, and that's putting it lightly. I mean, Marxism killed way more people than Nazism. But Marx was a rationalist. He was a materialist, and his belief system is effectively, it's summarized as dialectical materialism. It's basically a form of social alchemy where he uses reason to lay out a justification for basically acting out the patterns of envy, and as a result, all the productive people in Russia were killed by unproductive alcoholic peasants, and we ended up with millions of people dead, not just in Russia, but in China and South America and Africa as well. But yeah, that's basically the end result of rationalism. And there's some other problems with it as well. So Nietzsche basically pointed out that rationality depends very much on the initial axioms and the initial definitions and motivations that the person has. And this is basically the postmodern problem fleshed out. And the postmodern problem is basically, well, let's put it like this. Rationalism presupposes certain definitions and terms, and it presupposes a self-evident material reality. And the postmodern thinkers basically say the material reality, even if that is material reality, is very much dependent on our perceptions. Our perceptions are dependent on our emotions, our culture, our religion. And the problem with postmodernism is it leads to a sort of relativistic state. So this is where you get the traditions of moral relativism, because if we can't even perceive, and all of our logic and rationality and positivism is based on perception, and we're basically really bad at perceiving things, and we perceive things according to the dictates and presuppositions of our culture that are sort of unconscious, then rationality is effectively an insufficient tool at best, and at worst it's an absurdity. So this gave rise to art movements like absurdism, and Salvador Dali's clocks paintings, I think, are a pretty good example of postmodern. art. But of course, the most famous one is the "This is not a pipe" painting, which just has a picture of a pipe and it says "This is not a pipe." And, it's true because the word pipe looks nothing like a pipe. And it's pointing out the errors of perception and category structure and cognition and all these things that make rationality and logic, and certainly logical positivism, which is basically logic and rationality as a moral structure, like Steven Pinker believes, an impossibility, an absurdity, or maybe just a useful bit of futility. So all this being said, how does this tie into like racism and all that stuff? And why do we get this insistence with postmodernists that you have to be non-racist, anti-racist, you have to be not just not biased, but deeply anti-biased. You have to be violently opposed to the concept of bias in any way. Well, and that is their moral structure, because postmodernism doesn't inherently have a moral structure, but because it's basically a refutation of logic, and it's an accurate refutation of logic, as a means of pure sense-making. But that being said, it relates to... Okay, so let me first go back and say that every tradition, every philosophical tradition has a contradiction that gives rise to its morality. So with Christianity, with classical sort of beliefs, Christian beliefs, the contradiction is that we are a fallen being incapable of morality, and yet we are supposed to be like Christ, who is the embodiment of morality in that tradition. So this is a contradiction that gives rise to people acting out more moral, and in a sense to, or in an attempt to undo the fall of man, or original sin. So we are sinful beings, therefore it's our responsibility to be moral. The contradiction of modernism that gives rise to its morality, and the morality of rationalism and logical positivism, which is still quite popular today, unfortunately, thanks to people like Steven Pinker and Sean Carroll and Richard Dawkins and all these people. Secular humanism is a perfect example of this, and its flaws. What's it called? The contradiction of modernism is that we're basically talking monkeys who should have no grasp of reality whatsoever, and yet we are tasked with being rational. And I think this is where drives to create things like AI come from. I think the AI singularity is an eschaton. It's a sort of heaven, an end-of-the-world scenario, where we ultimately can prove our fallen nature as irrational, or redeem ourselves of our fallen nature as irrational beings through the process of creating something that is a construct of pure rationality, that is more pragmatic and effective than we are in the world. And the conflict of postmodernism, which gives rise to its morality of harm avoidance, basically, which is a pretty shallow and pathetic morality from my perspective, is that we're basically biased creatures. But you're supposed to be anti-biased, right? And you see that in the works of people like Kimberly Crenshaw and whatnot, and because they don't have a bulwark to defend against the inherent bias of human beings, they just know, they have this gut feeling that it's bad, despite the fact that they've already swallowed the concept that we're all talking monkeys and we're not rational. They're trying to be rational. They've probably unconsciously swallowed the doctrine of original sin, which is that we're a fallen being and immoral by nature and have to strive to be moral. And now they're trying to swallow the concept that we're biased creatures and have to therefore strive to be unbiased. So if you're ever wondering why the conflation between moral relativism and being an anti-racist and an anti-homophobe and all that shit, why it seems like a contradiction and I'm not the first person to compare this to Original Sin. Plenty of people have done that. Douglas Murray, Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson, all these people. Even Sam Harris is backwards, and his thinking is cutting edge thinking before Nietzsche, basically. But that being said, all these people have figured that out, and so it's hardly an original idea, but it's just an interesting concept to think about, the conflict of a fallen nature with an impossible task of endless striving. Gives people something to do, and I guess we'll see where that goes. I mean, in the same way that attempting to purge the world of sin resulted in witch burnings, the BLM riots caused $2 billion of damage in the George Floyd summer of, I believe it was 2020 or 2021. So it's just food for thought. Till next time.